So you might think to yourself that you want to quit podcasting because you're not seeing the return on your investment. Maybe you're not seeing return on investment in download numbers. Well, we have to kind of diagnose some of those problems and hopefully get you some traction to your website. It's all coming up next. Hey there, podcaster. My name is the Shan Man, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer. And today's video is powered by Agora Pulse. And we are talking about whether or not you should quit podcasting because you've started a podcast and you're not getting the traction that you think that you deserve. You're not getting the download numbers, or maybe you're just not getting the attention that you deserve. You're basically, in other words, you're saying, I have no one listening and no one is engaging with me. And let's try and fix some of those problems for you, okay? This topic that we're talking about today was all inspired by a Facebook post that I had seen in a group. And the individual had said that she was not seeing any type of traction whatsoever. And she said, when is a good time to quit podcasting? And I thought that's just so discouraging to hear because no one should just quit podcasting. And, you know, and I say that so that if you know why you're podcasting, then you shouldn't quit podcasting. And I think that comes to my very first point. My very first point being, you should understand really your purpose in podcasting. Do you know what type of podcast that you're going to do? And okay, yeah, let's say you already know the type of podcast you already know how to do, but do you know the reason why you're podcasting? Do you know the reason for that podcast? Maybe your podcast is in the digital marketing space. You probably have already figured out the purpose for your podcast is maybe to drive leads back to your website so that you can teach other people the knowledge that you have accrued over the years. Maybe your podcast is more in an entertainment space. Maybe it's about comedy, or maybe it's about true crime. What is the purpose behind your podcast? In the instance of, say, like true crime, or the instance of entertainment or comedy, maybe all you're trying to do is to educate someone. You're trying to entertain them through education, or maybe you're just trying to entertain them through laughs, through comedy, very similar to morning show radio. But you have to understand your purpose. If you don't understand your purpose, then what's the point of even doing a podcast? Let's say you have a travel podcast. What's the purpose behind your podcast? Is your purpose to share with people the top travel destinations and what they can do with those travel destinations, and how can you be a benefit to them? I think when it all comes down to it, if you don't understand the purpose of your podcast and you don't understand your why, and you're going to hear that a lot with a lot of podcasters and a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of musicians and any artist that is out there, they're going to ask you, what's your why? Why are you doing it? Are you doing it to help people? Are you doing it to kind of knock two birds out with one stone by being of service to people in some way, so that, yeah, maybe you can get paid for your passion, but you're just helping people all around all together? It's very similar to what I'm doing here on this podcasting channel here on YouTube. I'm trying to share the answers with podcasters because they overthink the process way too much. So let's try and diagnose some of the problems that we can maybe fix for you so you can get some traction to your website or your podcast, all right? Number one, let's talk about using Twitter effectively, using this social media platform effectively. Now, you've heard me talk about Agora Pulse, and I do understand that not all podcasters are going to have all the money in the world to spend on all these fancy tools that will make your podcast get traction. But I will say this, if you're using something like Twitter at the very basic level, it still can be effective. I just so happen to use a tool called Agora Pulse that will schedule my tweets out with the appropriate hashtags. Now, because this channel is all based around podcasting, I've definitely gone to my website, I've created blogs, and if you haven't seen any of the blogs on my website, they're very similar to these videos. But I create the blogs for search engine optimization and, of course, to share the quotes of those blogs onto Twitter. That's why show notes are really important. That's why you're doing show notes, so that you can use it as a promotional tool. And Agora Pulse makes that really easy for you, and it will reschedule posts after posts after posts. You might have seen that on my Twitter feed. You see these Twitter updates that come through if you subscribe to me or you follow me on Twitter, and they're all about podcasting. Now, it's just not for Twitter. I can schedule these out through Agora Pulse on LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever. But either way, at the end of the day, the key here is that I'm scheduling these posts out, but the real key is I'm using specific hashtags according to the niche. So if you didn't know, you can go into Twitter and you can go into their search bar and you can search out particular hashtags that are popular and you can see which ones are top and trending. And if you're posting within that particular niche and you post something about your podcast with a hashtag, you're going to get some traction. With the instance of this individual who was saying that they weren't getting any downloads, they weren't doing any promoting on something like Twitter, where it kind of lives on. It lives on through those hashtags. People are constantly looking through those hashtags. So think about Twitter and rethink of how you will use it. Whether you have to use something like TweetDeck or whether it's Hootsuite, doesn't matter. Figure out a way to schedule your tweets out so that you can constantly drive traffic back to your podcast episode or your web page. All right. I would recommend that you do show notes. There is a video up here all about show notes that you can learn why you're doing show notes and how to get them transcribed. It's up there to help you out. I promise you that. But you're using those transcriptions to promote your podcast. Number 2, let's talk all about your website. I know as a podcaster, you don't have all the money, like I said, for the tools, but you may need to get a website. And even if that's a website that is maybe a little on the lower end, but it's still offering value to your listeners. Now, the website will offer value in terms of things that podcast listeners will not be able to consume in audio. They can only consume them on your face or on your website. All right. Now, if you have that, that's great. That you got half the battle done. But the key here is that when you tell someone to go to your website.com, you should have buttons, or you should have the most prominent things above the fold on your website. This includes your buttons to go to iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever people can consume your podcast. You need to embed those buttons on your website so people can know where to listen to your podcast. I will tell you this right now. The more you put your link to where people can find your podcast, the more people are going to listen, and you're going to get an audience that will grow. It'll grow slowly over time, but it will grow. I promise you this. All right. So get those buttons, put them on your website. Find any way that you can mention your podcast on your website, because it's your podcast and you should be promoting it the right way. Now, if you don't want to do buttons, you can use audio players. I know that iTunes, I think, has an audio player now, like Apple Podcasts has an audio player. Stitcher definitely has an audio player that you can embed on your website, and it will play the latest episode of your podcast, and you can get some downloads and listens that way, and even some subscriptions that way too. So kind of think about the different tools that you can put on your website so people can listen to your podcast, so they can eventually hit that subscribe button and just get it coming straight to their phone. Number 3, are you actually creating real-time audio calls to actions within your podcast? This is something that a lot of podcasters miss out on. In fact, we were talking about this as of this week about calls to actions and when you should use the right calls to actions in radio. In podcasting, it's a little different. It's pre-recorded. You're using either an hour, maybe a half hour, or maybe even 2 hours of someone's time, and you have to figure out the right ways to put the right calls to action in your podcast. So are you asking your listeners to go subscribe to your podcast, leaving those ratings and reviews? Are you asking them to get on your email list? Are you asking them to go to your Patreon page and donate? Are you asking them to do these things? Now, you're not just asking them, but you're just kind of promoting it out there, saying, like, if you like this episode, don't forget to go on over to iTunes and subscribe. Apple Podcasts, I keep getting that wrong. Apple Podcasts, subscribe to our podcast and leave a rating and review, and you'll get episodes every week. If you're not on Apple, go to Stitcher, go to Google Play, and get the updates, and you can get subscriptions, get a subscription, and then, of course, you can listen to our podcast. I mean, that seems to me pretty simple. You should be able to tell your listeners what to do, and once you start treating these calls to actions as a part of your podcast, it's a listening behavior on your listeners' end that they'll know that you're promoting something, and it'll allow them to take an action, such as subscribing to your podcast. Number 4, are you actually interviewing guests that will help you promote your podcast? Are you interviewing guests that have a decent following? Are you interviewing guests who will just help promote altogether? It doesn't matter if they have a following or not. Are you getting these types of guests that are passionate just like you are? That's one thing that I think you should be doing, is getting guests that will share out your podcast. There's nothing better than to be on someone else's podcast and to be featured on someone else's podcast as an authority figure or someone who can share thoughts and share that podcast out to help that podcaster grow their audience. If you haven't done that, then I think you really should be doing that. On the same sense, you should also be going on other people's podcasts. You should be cross-pollinating your efforts with other podcasters, having them show up on your podcast and you showing up on theirs. Now, how do you get on other people's podcasts? You just have to build a community around that, whether that be in a Facebook group, whether it be within the comments on your blog section where you can get people to comment, and maybe you meet someone that's brand new within the comments or in a Facebook group. It doesn't matter. You have to constantly do your research. Use Twitter to go in and research who's doing the best things in comedy or true crime comedy. It doesn't matter what it is. You're going to have to do the work, but I guarantee this, people will other people's audiences you'll be able to leverage those other audiences to get more ears on your podcast. I have a couple of other tips on my website on this topic. I'll go ahead and leave a link down in the description below if you're interested. And of course, there's an audio blog portion of this. So if you want to hear it and you don't have time to listen or watch this video, you can listen to the audio portion of it on my website. It will help you out. If you like this video, go ahead and leave it a thumbs up. And of course, hit the subscribe button and make sure that you're hitting that little bell. See? Calls to action. Remind people to go do something. So go ahead, hit the subscribe button and the little bell, and that little bell will notify you when I drop a brand new video. And of course, I have all kinds of stuff on my website on this YouTube channel that will help you out. If you need to start a podcast, go ahead and jump on over and download my essential equipment guide to podcasting. That will get you started and pointed in the right direction as far as podcasting. And I'm working on a brand new project, a brand new podcast, believe it or not, and it's away from my original podcast, Be the Experience. In fact, this is a kind of a co-collaboration podcast. I am thinking about shutting down my Be the Experience, but folding it into this brand new podcast. So when that time comes, you will definitely know when that does get released. But I will tell you this, it's all about side hustling, and if you are anything, you are a podcaster who has a side hustle. Your podcast is your side hustle. You might like the podcast that's going to be coming out. So stay tuned to this channel. I might be starting a brand new channel for it, but there's definitely a brand new podcast coming soon to your ears. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Over here on your right-hand side, is it your right-hand side? Yes, it's your right-hand side. There's probably a video that's going to help you out with your podcasting journey and efforts, like the basic podcast setup. And in the meantime, I hope you guys have a good one. Talk to you soon.